Hey there, Agile Party people, and welcome to the next episode of the Agile Bytes podcast, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. If you follow us as a company on LinkedIn or me as an individual on LinkedIn, you probably saw that we dropped an episode. This is that episode. The good news for you is it should be tighter and more focused than the first time that I read through it because I'm tired of listening to myself talk about it. So it should be shorter this time. So you benefit from this as well. Today, we're going to be talking about limiting WIP, limiting work in process with Scrum. We all know, and if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, we've done several episodes on it, but we all know that having too much work in process is the root of all kinds of ills when it comes to our organization and delivery. So basically, this problem comes from the fact that we start work faster than we finish work. So we end up with multiple things that are currently being worked on but are not finished, and we keep starting new things. And so we end up eventually with a lot of things that are in progress, whether we're talking our number of projects and initiatives or our number of work items or whatever it is. We just have too much stuff going on. And whenever this is true, it slows down delivery, it ruins morale. It often causes us to feel pretty tight against deadlines and time boxes and things like that. We can't really be very predictable when we've got lots and lots of things in progress that are not getting delivered as opposed to a steady delivery rate. If you're on a Scrum team, this oftentimes looks like things getting carried over from sprint to sprint or nothing really being ready until the very end of the sprint. And then there's this kind of mad rush to finish things, get things tested, and get things ready for your sprint review. You might find that your Scrum team doesn't have a whole lot of capacity to respond to in-the-moment emergency kinds of things like feedback from QA or bug fixes or just other kinds of emergencies that might happen throughout your sprint. You might also find that every new user story that you start, it just seems to keep taking longer and longer as you start them. So a lot of times these can be indicator maybe that your team has too much work in process. And there's others as well. Like I said, we've got plenty of previous podcasts on this topic, and there's plenty out there to read about having too much WIP, too much work in process. Well, if you are trying to limit your WIP, then you may have been reading about different flow management strategies. Maybe you've looked at Kanban and you've read about WIP limits and you've decided to try those with your Scrum team. Or maybe you've read some things about tame flow or theory of constraints and you've run across the drum buffer rope scheduling technique. We also did a podcast episode on that. And you're trying to do those things. And those are all good things. You want to be a little bit careful because most flow management strategies assume that you are continuously working your work items. Scrum has a start-stop framework. The end of the sprint is an extinction level event. All work, in theory, is supposed to be done by the time the end of the sprint rolls around. So you sort of spin up, spin down, spin up, spin down, spin up, and spin down. And when that's your cadence, then flow management tools need a little bit of tweaking. You can't just drop them right on top of your sprints and expect magic to happen. You got to do some thinking about what these tools and metrics actually mean when you have kind of that stair-steppy start-stop pattern with sprints. But combining them, using them with your Scrum is great. A lot of teams have done it and it's brought them a lot of benefits, and I'm not trying to discourage that at all. But this episode is not about that. This is not about combining Kanban with Scrum or tame flow with Scrum, although there are large bodies of materials on both of those things. Did you know, are you aware, were you cognizant that Scrum actually has some built-in WIP limiting mechanisms? It's true. You might have known it and not recognized it, or maybe you're not taking full advantage of these WIP limiting mechanisms, but that's what we're going to talk about today. And there's two parts to the way Scrum is designed to limit WIP all by itself. No necessary need to bring in extra systems or extra strategies or whatever. Scrum actually has built into it a way to limit your WIP, and here's what it looks like. First of all, there's the sprint goal. Are you using sprint goals? It's a big part of the WIP limiting mechanism. The idea in Scrum is every sprint should have a reason for existing. There's some big move forward or some big capability, bigger than a user story level anyway, that you are trying to put into the product. You might think about it like a little MVP, for example. And the sprint goal is kind of the vision or the hypothesis for that MVP. You are spending that week or 2 weeks or whatever it is, and you are trying to accomplish some capability in that time box. What is that capability? And then you pick that capability, and then in sprint planning, you look at your product backlog and you pick the smallest number of items from that backlog that will achieve that capability. Now, in sprint planning, sometimes there's a little bit of negotiation and back and forth that has to happen. You may have a goal for your sprint, and you look at the backlog items that you need to accomplish that goal, and it's just not realistic to think you're going to get those items done in one sprint. So that may mean that the goal needs to be sliced a little bit, needs to be trimmed back some. But these two things working together are what limits WIP in Scrum, because you've got the sprint goal, and then you've got the smallest number of items that you can select that achieves that goal. Now, this is often where Scrum teams kind of start to balk a little bit, because what I've seen in a lot of Scrum teams is this urge to fill the sprint with backlog items. So let's say your sprint is 2 weeks, and let's say you pick a sprint goal, like this sprint, we want to spend it getting the ability for customers to pay in Canadian dollars, right? Or we want to be able to allow customers from Canada to order from our website. Right now, it's just the United States. We want to allow customers from Canada to buy from us. So that's our goal. So we go looking at the product backlog and we go, okay, what are the different things? What are the different capabilities we would need to build into the system to allow us to sell to customers in Canada, to allow customers in Canada to buy from us? And, it might be things like adding Canadian dollars as a currency, doing currency conversion. It may be Canadian payment gateways or Canadian payment options or something like that. It could mean putting in options to ship to Canadian addresses and maybe Canadian carriers and shippers that are now part of your shipping options. There's all kinds of things that capability might look like. So the sprint goal is we want people from Canada to be able to buy from us. Okay, so we're going to try to enable that in the sprint. So we start looking at the backlog, we pull the items that we think will make that sprint goal work, and we want the smallest amount of items we can. Now, all we need to worry about is it realistic for that quantity of work items to fit into the sprint or not? If not, then we shrink the goal. So maybe the goal of enabling everything about the capability of buying in Canada is a little too much for one sprint. So maybe this sprint is about enabling payment in Canadian dollars. Or maybe this sprint is about incorporating shipping to Canadian addresses, Canadian shippers. Maybe this sprint is about currency conversion. But anyway, you pick the sprint goal and then you trim down the number of items in your sprint backlog to match. Now, let's say the opposite occurs. Let's say I pick a sprint goal and I start pulling items from the backlog and I think, okay, well, we're going to meet this goal in 2 or 3 user stories. We still have a lot of sprint left. What should we do? Well, my advice is not to plan for that time. Once you've met your sprint goal and it is signed, sealed, and delivered, right? It's fully tested. All your automated tests are passing. You've maybe gotten some preliminary feedback from people and incorporated that. QA has run it through the ringer. Your devs have run it through the ringer. Everybody feels good about it. And you still have lots of sprint left. You always have the option of pulling more work if you want, because you've already achieved your sprint goal. You also have the option of doing valuable activities that are not production work. We've talked about this in other podcasts about capacity. There's all kinds of things that dev teams can be doing that are valuable that are not starting new production work. There's always test coverage we could improve. There's always documentation that could be updated. There's always upskilling that needs to be done. There's always research and proofs of concept. There's always things that the dev team might want to try and see if it improves things, but we've just never really had the time or the space to do that. All those things can happen in that extra time too. Keep in mind, the sprint goal plus your sprint length, the sprint time box, that's a very powerful WIP limiting mechanism. You are trying to get the lowest amount of work defined that you possibly can. The goal for sprint planning is not to fill the sprint with backlog items. That is not what sprint planning is for. Sprint planning is finalizing the sprint goal and then having a backlog of items that will accomplish that sprint goal and making sure that that backlog is accomplishable in the sprint. That's what you're trying to do in sprint planning. You are not trying to fill every available day or hour with work on user stories. You are trying to accomplish a sprint goal, and you want to limit your work by pulling the minimum amount of items that will accomplish it. If you are using those two things together, and you are truly being rigorous about realistic sprint goals and the lowest number of items that you can select to meet that sprint goal, you're going to be doing a pretty good job of limiting your WIP from sprint to sprint all by itself. And then, of course, if you have extra sprint time, if you want to pull in another item from the backlog to just knock it out, that's your prerogative. I generally think there are better ways to use that time, but if you want to keep doing user stories, you're more than welcome to do that. But in terms of your plan for the sprint, it's all about the goal and a minimum amount of items that will meet that goal. Now, are there other things you can do in Scrum that limit WIP without having to bring in other kinds of strategies like Kanban? Yeah, absolutely. For example, one thing you can do if you're not doing it already is have your team swarm, which means you take your highest priority backlog item and you put as many people on that backlog item as you can, as it makes sense. This is something I see a lot of teams not doing well, probably because of Jira, but I see a lot of teams that are like one item, one developer, one item, one developer, one item, one developer. When really what you want to do is take your top priority item and think, how many developers could work on this? Could this person be doing the API endpoint while this other person is doing the UI, while this other person is doing the database tables, while this other person is making changes in the repository? That's 4 different developers right there that could be working on that item at the same time. And even if you feel like you're going to be stepping on toes too much, I've yet to find a backlog item of reasonable complexity where at least 2 developers couldn't be working on it. So be rigorous about your swarming. That's another way to limit work in progress because you're allocating more people to getting a single item done as opposed to trying to get multiple items started with individuals. The other thing you can do is just to make sure that before you start a new card, you've completed one. Don't pull new backlog items until you have finished them. You would think that this would just be a common sense way of working. Even if you have individual developers on each item, just make sure they don't start a new one until they finish the one they're working on. I don't know how this happens, but it's ubiquitous. I will look at teams' boards and I'll see all the time several more cards in progress than there are actual individuals available to work on them. Even if it was 1 card per person, they still have too many. How does this happen? I don't know. People get bored. People think, well, while I'm in the neighborhood, I'll try to knock this other thing out too. Or maybe they hit a blocker on one item, so they put it aside and start a brand new item. And eventually you end up with, 4 developers and 6 cards in development. Just don't do that. Just make it your policy that we don't start new cards until the cards we're working on are finished or as finished as we can possibly get them. Also, make sure your team is paying attention to work item age. Focus on your oldest cards. If I've got a backlog item that I pulled at the beginning of the sprint and we're 2/3 of the way through the sprint and that card is still open, then in our daily stand-up, we need to be having a conversation about what can we do about that card. Can we put more people on it? Can we switch people out? Does that person need help? Is there a blocker that needs to be resolved? If we pay attention to our aging work items, we're always prioritizing the oldest items. That also has the net effect of limiting work in progress because then instead of having a card sit out there the entire sprint while we're doing other cards that are kind of flowing around it, we're focused on moving that card out the door and not starting new cards. So let me throw those things out there for you that if you're looking to limit work in progress with Scrum, if you want to use flow-based strategies like Kanban or Tame Flow, don't let me talk you out of that. Those are great strategies to look at. They may work out great for your team. But I just want to make sure you're aware that Scrum has its own mechanisms to limit WIP. And if you are diligent about the sprint goal, selecting the minimum amount of work to hit that sprint goal, making sure that you are not jeopardizing that sprint goal by trying to do other things until that sprint goal is done. And then just good doing flow-based development stuff like swarming, paying attention to work item aging, and finishing things before you start new things. I think you'll find that Scrum can have you limiting WIP all by itself. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.